Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to talk to you about the equalization method of curing, or the EQ method as it's otherwise known. So this method is used primarily for curing whole muscle cuts of meat. It's a really useful means of curing. It has some distinct advantages and I'll cover those in a little while. But where did it come from and what is it? So let me first explain where it came from, because I think that will give you an insight into how we work with it now. So the EQ method of curing came originally from a method known as the salt box method. And this is where meat was immersed in salt, which had a cure agent in it. It was tossed around in that salt, taken out, all the excess salt was rubbed off it, and it was popped into a non-reactive dish to cure. And this method worked for years and years and years, but it was a little bit artisan, it was a little bit ad hoc. And like anything, we like repeatability and consistency. So we tried to apply a little bit of method to it. And that's how it grew. So basically, the EQ method works on the principle of working out a percentage saltiness for a particular whole muscle cut of meat that we want to cure. And the way we do it is we determine that level of saltiness initially. And let's say, for instance, the range that we want to work with is between, say, 1.5% saltiness and 3% saltiness. I tend to go for about 2.5% personally. That's my personal preference, but if you don't like that much salt, you can have it a little bit lower. And if you like it really punchy, you can put up to about 3% in. I wouldn't recommend going above that because it's a little bit too salty. So once you've determined your level of salt, you then need to weigh the meat, because the salt is going to be a proportion of the weight of the meat. And once you've done that and you've weighed out your ingredients, you put the ingredients onto the meat and then you put the meat in a bag. So because we're using such small quantities of salt, we want to ensure that they're going to be in very close proximity to the meat. So EQ curing is done in usually in a vacuum bag to keep the meat in very close proximity to the salt. Because you want to get the maximum bang for your buck. You don't want any of that salt to go to waste by running off and not doing its job. And after all, if we're measuring out the salt so that we've got a precise measure for the finished product, we want every bit of that salt to be used. So generally, curing on a vacuum is the norm. Okay, so the EQ method, I'm going to give you some advantages and some disadvantages of using it. And then at the very end of the video, I'm going to give you a worked example. So let's talk about some of the advantages of using the EQ method. And there are quite a few, but let's go through them. So first of all, it gives us a standard method of curing the meat. And that's really important. I think we all like to have standards that we can use time and time again. It just makes things a lot easier for us and it takes away a lot of the guesswork. Another advantage is it's less dependent on a minimum curing time. And what I mean by that is because we are using a specific amount of salt, it doesn't matter how long we leave it in that bag, it's never going to overcure. It's never going to absorb too much salt because we've measured it out very carefully. So that's an important consideration. Another advantage is it's more accurate and it's repeatable. So that goes back to the first advantage I was talking about having a standardized method. The fact that you can repeat this process time and time again makes it very, very useful if you're going to be doing this as a production process. Another advantage is that it can be applied to many different whole muscle cuts of meat. So you don't just have to be curing bacon, you could be doing culatello, you could be doing a ham, you could be doing coppa or even bresaola. But any whole muscle cut of meat you can cure like this. Even pastrami. Another real benefit, as I've kind of outlined earlier, is that it eliminates the danger of over curing the meat. so that it's too salty. I think that's one thing that is always mentioned to me whenever I'm having questions about curing meat. It's always about, oh, I did this or I did that and it was way too salty. How can I avoid that? Well, the EQ method is one great way of avoiding that. And I think one of the most important things, certainly for someone who's new to curing, if you're a novice curer, I would say the EQ method is a massive advantage to you, because it takes away a lot of that guesswork that you would have if you were doing this using another method. Use the EQ method and you will not be able to overcure your meat. Let's have a look at some of the disadvantages for using the EQ method. So some of the drawbacks for using the EQ method can be that it takes a little bit longer to cure. Now, because we're using a minimum amount of salt and we want to get the maximum bang for our buck, we need to leave it in a little bit longer. And 10 days to 14 days curing is not unusual when you're using such low levels of salt. It requires the use of specialist equipment. Now, there are a lot of home vacuum machines on the market which aren't too expensive. So for under, I would say, 40 or 50 pounds or $50, you could get yourself a vacuum machine with a roll of vacuum bags and you can be set up to do this very, very cheaply. Because you're using such small measures, you need to have accurate scales. Now, I know a lot of old school curers like using teaspoons or half teaspoon measures, certainly when it comes to Prague powder. I personally don't like to take those chances. I've got in my drawer 8 different teaspoons and they're all different sizes, and I can guarantee you'll never be able to get the same accuracy as if you use accurate scales. So you do need to go and get some accurate scales. One of the less obvious drawbacks of using this EQ method is that you do need to do a little bit of maths to calculate the level of salt you require and the level of cure you need. Now, that's not too difficult once you've done it a couple of times and you've laid out your calculations. It works time and time again, so you don't have to worry too much about it. But it's just a concern some people have with maths. It's not too complicated, it's quite simple, but you know, take your time with it, work through the worked example that I'm going to show you at the end of the video, and you shouldn't have any problems going forward. And a last general concern, I think it's less of a drawback, but it's more of a concern, and that is to be accurate in whatever you're doing. So you need to make accurate measurements. Although you've got these accurate scales, having them is one thing, using them accurately is another. And I think that's really important for anything in life. You know, if you're going to do it properly. So let's look at a worked example. So let's assume that our meat is 1 kilogram. Therefore, we have to work out 2.5% salt for that. Now, the way I do this is I use a multiplier, and I use 1,000 for my kilogram because that's 1,000 grams. And there we go. So 2.5, and that will give me 2.5%, and that works out at 25 grams of salt. So 25 grams is 2.5% of 1 kilogram, and that is my salt measure. But here's the thing, that is the total salt I want to put into that piece of meat. So what I have to do is I have to calculate how much cure I'm going to put in, and that's worked out in a slightly different way. That's worked out at 2.5 grams per kilogram of meat. Because we have a piece of meat that is a kilogram, we only need 2.5 grams. Now, if your meat wasn't a kilogram, the maths are slightly more complicated. So the way I do this is I use a multiplier again, and that multiplier is for working out 2.5 grams, or how many grams to use for a given size of meat, you times that meat by 0.0025, and that will give you the curing salt in grams for that particular size of meat. So for a kilogram, that works out at 2.5 grams. Okay, so we've got that 2.5 grams, but we've also got 25 grams of salt. So what we need to do is reduce the salt by 2.5 grams and then add back into that the cure that we're going to put into that meat to make it have the nice colour and that sort of cured meat flavour profile. So we'll end up with 25 grams, but it'll be made up of 22.5 grams of salt and 2.5 grams of cure. And we'll blend those two together, put them in the vacuum bag, and then we'll cure that. So, but what if your meat isn't exactly 1 kilogram? So let's say, for instance, our meat is 1.125 kilograms, so 1,125 grams. Well, let's do that. Let's work that through. So let's put that in. 1,125 grams. Now we're going to times that. We want 2.5 grams of salt.
Oops, slip of the tongue there. What I meant to say was we are calculating for 2.5% salt. Sorry. Right, back to the vid.
So we're going to multiply that by 0.025, and that will give us 28.125 grams of salt. Now, we know that that's the total amount of salt. So what we want to do is we want to work out how much cure. So we put in the same numbers again, 1,125 grams. And then what we do is we times that, we multiply it by 0.0025, and that gives us 2.8125 grams. Let's call it 2.8 grams for ease of maths. So 2.8 grams. Now we've got the 28.125 grams. Well, for ease, let's call that 28 grams of salt, and we need to take off 2.8 grams from that salt. So we are going to have 25.2 grams of salt, and on top of that we're going to have 2.8 grams of Prague.
And when we add this back to the 25.2 grams of salt, this gives us a total cure of 28 grams.
So let me talk to you very briefly about the curing salt that we're going to be using. I use Prague powder number 1 for meats that I'm going to be cooking, so the meats that require an additional cooking process. So for instance, if you're making pastrami that's going to be cooked, or you're curing some bacon that is obviously going to be cooked, I'd use Prague 1. Prague powder number 2, it's a slightly different cure. It has agents in it which you don't really want to add heat to and cook through, so it's generally used for charcuterie and cured meats that aren't going to go through a cooking process. So they're eaten raw after curing. Obviously not raw, but they're eaten after curing. So that's the general distinction that I make there. And the salt I'm using, well, I use ordinary table salt here. It's got no added, nothing else added other than an anti-caking agent. But if you want to use kosher salt, that's absolutely fine. If you want to use sea salt as well, that's absolutely fine too. But I really do like this method. I urge you give it a go, because it is really kind of very easy if you're new to curing. Even if you're an old hand. I mean, I've been doing this for decades, and I absolutely love it. I find it really, really easy to do. The results are consistent. I'm sure you'll love it. If you do, let us know what you think in the comments. I'll be interested to hear what you think about the EQ method, and if you've got any other applications that you think it's useful for. I know for a fact that it can be used in other methods, and I'll talk about those in a future video. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next video. Cheerio now. Bye-bye.